Think about the last completely ordinary thing your body did without asking you. A yawn you couldn't stop halfway through. That involuntary stretch first thing in the morning, arms out, spine cracking, before your brain has even fully switched on. A shiver you didn't decide to have. Your body runs a whole hidden catalog of these, built-in behaviors, ancient reflexes you never sat down and learned, that you can't really switch off, that every human who has ever lived has done in more or less exactly the same way. You didn't invent them, your parents didn't teach them, they came standard. And here is a behavior that belongs on that exact same list. Biologically, right next to the yawn and the shiver, even though we almost never, ever talk about it that way. Did ancient humans masturbate? I know. It sounds like a joke question, the kind of thing you'd laugh off at the back of a history class. But it genuinely isn't, because the honest answer pulls a thread that unravels something strange about our entire species. The behavior itself is one of the oldest and most ordinary things in all of nature. It is older than humans. It is older than primates. It has been quietly happening across the animal kingdom for tens of millions of years. So, the real mystery was never whether ancient humans did it. Of course they did. The real mystery, the thing actually worth the next 20 minutes, is how we became the only species on Earth that ever learned to feel bad about it. Let's get into it. First, we have to completely reset how you're picturing this, because the framing most people carry is backwards. Nobody discovered masturbation. There was no clever ancestor who figured it out one afternoon and taught the others. It isn't a human invention, it isn't a modern habit, and it isn't a sign of anything. Asking whether ancient humans did it is, biologically speaking, a little like asking whether they blinked or whether they scratched an itch. The behavior is so old and so widespread in nature that it sits firmly in the category of things a body with a certain kind of nervous system simply does. And I want to prove that to you, not just assert it, because this is the foundation the whole video rests on. So let's leave humans entirely for a moment and look at the rest of the animal kingdom, because that's where this stops being a joke and starts being biology. This behavior has been observed and documented by scientists, actual field researchers, in peer-reviewed studies across a genuinely staggering range of species. Our closest relatives, the great apes, do it routinely. So do monkeys of many kinds. But it doesn't stop at primates, and this is the part that surprises people. It's been recorded in dogs, in horses, in elephants, in dolphins and whales, in walruses, in deer, squirrels, bats, and a long list of others that would honestly make the rest of this sentence sound like a strange zoo inventory. The point is not the list. The point is what the list means. When a behavior shows up independently across mammals separated from each other by tens of millions of years of evolution, that tells you something fundamental. It tells you this isn't a quirk, or a vice, or a learned bad habit. It's a deep feature of how a certain kind of nervous system is wired. It requires no culture to pass it on. It requires no teacher. It shows up wherever the underlying biology shows up, which is almost everywhere. So by the time anything resembling a human walked the earth, this was not some frontier waiting to be explored. It was ancient, standard, inherited equipment, running quietly in the background of the animal world long before our species had a background at all. Which raises the obvious question. If it's this common, this old, and this automatic, why does it exist in the first place? What is it actually for? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the honest scientific answer is, it's complicated, and it's still debated. But there are some solid, well-supported ideas, and they all point back to the same root. The simplest explanation is that this behavior is essentially a side effect, a byproduct of having a powerful built-in drive to reproduce. Evolution wired animals very strongly to seek out the sensations associated with reproduction, because the animals that felt that pull passed on their genes, and the ones that shrugged and didn't bother, didn't. That drive is one of the most powerful forces in all of biology, and a drive that strong, that deeply wired into the reward system of the brain, doesn't switch itself off neatly when a partner isn't around. The wiring is simply there, all the time. This behavior is, in a sense, that ancient wiring expressing itself on its own. But researchers have proposed that it may be more than just a harmless side effect. That in some species it might actually do useful biological work. Various hypotheses have been floated and studied. That it may play a role in keeping the reproductive system healthy and functional. That it may help relieve tension or stress. that in some animals it might even factor into reproductive success in subtle ways. There are researchers who have spent serious portions of their careers, straight-faced, observing squirrels and primates in the wild specifically to measure this, which tells you it's a real scientific question, and also that biology is not a field for the easily embarrassed. The science here is genuinely unsettled, and I'm not going to pretend it's more certain than it is. Different researchers weigh these ideas differently. But notice what every one of these explanations has in common. Not a single one of them requires shame. Not one of them treats the behavior as a problem to be solved or a weakness to be overcome. In the entire scientific and natural picture, across millions of years and thousands of species, the behavior is just there, ordinary, unremarkable, a feature of biology, like hunger or sleep. Hold on to that because it's about to matter enormously. Okay, let's finally come back to humans. Specifically, ancient humans. Because now the question, did they do it, almost answers itself. We are apes. We inherited the same deep wiring as every other creature we just talked about. There is no biological switch that could have turned this off in early humans, and absolutely no reason one would have evolved. So, on the evidence of basic biology alone, the answer is already yes, comfortably, without any need for further proof. But we can actually go a step further because ancient humans left us clues about their relationship with the body and with sex. And those clues paint a consistent picture. Some of the oldest art humanity ever produced, carved and painted tens of thousands of years ago, deals with the human body, with fertility, and with sex directly and frankly. We've talked before about the so-called Venus figurines, ancient carvings emphasizing the body and fertility, made by people who had almost nothing and still chose to spend precious time making them. Across the ancient world, in many different cultures, depictions of the body and of sexuality were carved into walls, shaped into objects, and woven into mythology, often completely openly. Now, we have to be careful here, because you can't read a cave painting like a diary. We can't reach back 30,000 years and know exactly what any individual felt in a private moment. But the broad pattern in the evidence is striking and consistent. Our distant ancestors were, on the whole, remarkably matter-of-fact about the human body and its functions. The frantic embarrassment that many modern people feel around this entire subject does not appear to be the ancient default human condition. If anything, the evidence points the other way. So, picture it honestly, without the modern flinch. Ancient humans lived in small groups, close to their own biology, with none of the layers of privacy, architecture, and taboo we've since built up. The behavior we're talking about would have been, to them, roughly as noteworthy as scratching an itch. Ordinary. Not sinful. Not dangerous. Not a secret to agonize over. Just a thing a body does. Which brings us to the actual turn in this story. Because if it was that ordinary for that long, what changed? Before we get to what changed, it's worth pausing on just how much the attitudes varied, because this is where people tend to assume history was simpler than it was. There was never one single ancient attitude toward this behavior, any more than there's one single modern attitude toward it today. Human cultures are wildly inventive when it comes to deciding what's normal and what's forbidden, and this behavior got sorted very differently depending on where and when you happened to be born. In some societies and periods, it barely registered as worth a comment, a private, unremarkable fact of having a body. In others, it got folded into elaborate ideas about energy, vitality, and balance. Sometimes discouraged not because it was thought sinful, but because certain traditions believed bodily fluids and vital forces were finite resources you shouldn't squander. In still others, it was treated with a shrug for some people and disapproval for others, depending on their role, their status, or their gender. That last point matters more than it first appears. In a lot of cultures, the rules around the body were never applied evenly. Attitudes toward this behavior often tracked exactly onto who a society was already anxious about controlling, frequently landing far more heavily on women or on the young than on anyone else. The supposed concern was framed as being about health or morality, but look closely and it often lines up suspiciously well with who a culture wanted to keep in line. The behavior was universal. The judgment, conveniently, was not. So, the picture across the deep past isn't a clean one of universal acceptance followed by a fall into shame. It's messier and more human than that. A scattered patchwork of attitudes, most of them far more relaxed than what was coming, and none of them resembling the specific, intense, fear-soaked version that would eventually take hold. That version, the one many of us inherited, needed particular ingredients to come together, and they hadn't yet. Here's what changed, not the behavior, the story we told about it. For most of the human timeline, there's little sign that this ordinary act was treated as some grave moral danger. Attitudes varied enormously from culture to culture, as attitudes about the body always do. Some more relaxed, some more restrictive. But the specific intense idea that this particular behavior is uniquely shameful, harmful, and dangerous is not some ancient, universal truth humans have always known. It is comparatively recent, and you can actually watch it get assembled over time, layer by layer. The first major layer is moral and religious. As various organized belief systems developed and spread, many of them began to attach strong moral weight to sexuality in general, channeling it, regulating it, tying it to ideas of purity, sin, and self-control. Within that broader project of moralizing the body, this specific behavior got swept up and increasingly framed as a failing of discipline or virtue. The very word many people still reach for, self-abuse, comes straight out of this era. And look at what it's quietly doing. It turns a person into both the offender and the victim of the same ordinary act. That's the whole shift, packed into a single phrase. The details differed hugely between traditions and eras, and I'm compressing centuries of complicated history here. But the overall direction was a slow move from a thing a body does toward a thing a good person resists. That was layer one. It became a moral issue, but the second layer is the one that really turned shame into full-blown fear, and it's the part of the story that is, frankly, almost unbelievable, because it came dressed up as science. A few centuries ago, and especially as you move into the 1700s and 1800s, something remarkable happened. Physicians, respected medical authorities of their day, began confidently declaring that this ordinary behavior was not just a moral weakness, but a genuine medical catastrophe, a cause of disease, a destroyer of health, and they did not hold back. Over the years, with total confidence and essentially zero real evidence, this single behavior was blamed for an astonishing catalog of ailments: blindness, deafness, madness and insanity, epilepsy, weakness, exhaustion, and a kind of general wasting away. Poor memory, acne, even an early death. Entire influential medical texts were written on the supposed dangers. It was treated in all seriousness as a public health crisis. And because these were the doctors, the authorities, the experts of their time, people believed them. This fear rippled outward into everyday life in ways that shaped how people were raised for generations. Anxious parents were warned to watch their children for signs of it. An entire industry of contraptions, restraints, special diets, and cures sprang up, marketed to worried families desperate to protect their kids from a danger that did not actually exist. Some of the bland breakfast foods you might have eaten this morning trace their origins, historically, to exactly this movement. Foods deliberately designed to be unstimulating, invented by people who genuinely believed a plain diet would suppress this supposedly ruinous urge. Let that sink in for a second. A completely ordinary, ancient, harmless animal behavior, one shared with dolphins and elephants and our own ape cousins, was, within the last few centuries, declared a medical emergency serious enough to reshape childhoods, sell products, and haunt people with genuine terror. Not because new evidence had emerged. There was no evidence. It was moral disapproval, wearing the costume of medicine. And here's the twist that makes this whole story land. Every single one of those medical claims was wrong. Completely, provably wrong. As actual rigorous science developed, real studies, real evidence, real standards, the entire edifice of supposed harm simply collapsed. It doesn't cause blindness. It doesn't cause madness. It doesn't cause any of the diseases it was blamed for. Modern medical consensus is clear and boring and reassuring. This is a normal, common, and harmless behavior. The scary science of earlier centuries turned out to be not science at all. It was a moral panic that had borrowed the authority of medicine to make itself sound like fact. But here's the thing about fear that has been building for generations. It doesn't vanish just because the claims underneath it were debunked. The specific accusations, the blindness, the madness, mostly faded. But the general cloud of shame and secrecy they left behind lingered, drifting on, detached from any of the reasons it was originally invented. A lot of the discomfort people still feel today is essentially an echo, It's the aftershock of a panic whose original claims everyone has quietly abandoned, but whose emotional residue never fully cleared. But there's a deeper question hiding underneath all of this, and it's worth asking directly. If the behavior is harmless, ancient, and universal, why did the shame catch on so easily and so widely? Why didn't people just laugh the doctors and the moralists out of the room? The uncomfortable answer is that shame around the body is an extraordinarily useful tool, and not for the person feeling it. Think about what a taboo actually does. It takes something everybody experiences, makes it unspeakable, and in doing so, hands enormous influence to whoever gets to define the rules. If a behavior is ordinary and openly discussed, no one can hold much power over you with it. But if that same behavior is secret, shameful, and loaded with the threat of disease or damnation, then the people who position themselves as the gatekeepers of purity, moral, medical, or otherwise, suddenly have real leverage over how you feel about yourself. And a private behavior is the perfect target, precisely because it's private. You can't prove you're not doing it. You can't defend yourself against the accusation. All you can do is carry the anxiety inward, monitor yourself, and feel grateful to whoever offers to help you resist. A rule you enforce on yourself, in the dark, out of shame, is far cheaper and far more effective than any rule that has to be enforced from the outside. The most efficient cage is the one a person builds inside their own head and then thanks you for. None of this required a grand conspiracy. It rarely does. It's just that ideas which make people easier to manage tend to spread and stick, generation after generation, while ideas that don't tend to quietly fade. A harmless behavior wrapped in shame turned out to be remarkably good at sticking. The behavior survived because it's biology. The shame survived because it was useful. To everyone except the person feeling it. So let's pull the whole thing back together, because the shape of this story is the entire point. The behavior itself is ancient almost beyond comprehension. It is older than humanity, older than primates, woven into the biology of creatures across the entire animal kingdom. It came pre-installed in our ancestors the same way blinking and yawning did. Ancient humans did it, easily, ordinarily, and by every indication we have, without the slightest sense that it was shameful or dangerous. For the overwhelming majority of the human story, it was simply a thing a body does. The shame is the recent part. The shame is the invention, layered on first by centuries of moral disapproval, then supercharged by a few hundred years of confident, completely mistaken pseudo-medicine, and finally left to linger as a vague, sourceless discomfort, long after every specific claim behind it had been proven false. We took one of the most ordinary behaviors in all of nature and, in a very short slice of our history, built one of the most elaborate structures of guilt around it that we've ever built around anything. And that really is a pattern you see again and again with our species. We inherit something ancient and ordinary and animal, and then we can't leave it alone. We wrap it in meaning, in rules, in fear, in story, until the simple biological fact underneath is almost buried. The behavior didn't change across all that time. We did. We're the ones who added the weight. So the next time you feel that little flicker of awkwardness around a topic like this one, that instinct to laugh it off or look away, it's worth remembering where that flicker actually comes from. It isn't ancient wisdom. It isn't your body warning you about something dangerous. It's a hand-me-down, an echo of a panic that history has already disproven, still rattling around in how we feel long after we stopped believing the reasons for it. The body was never the strange part. The story we built on top of it was. If you could go back and explain to those confident old physicians, the ones who blamed this ordinary thing for blindness and madness, that they were completely wrong, and that dolphins, elephants, and every ape in the forest had been doing it perfectly happily for millions of years, do you think they'd believe you? Or would they be too certain to listen? Let me know in the comments. See you soon.